So thanks for that session, Molani. I think it's a great introduction or great next step into the TCFD recommendations. For our participants today, the next part of today's session is going to be a little bit content heavy, so the slides are a bit text heavy, but just to note that the slides and things will be shared with participants after this. So I'll go through it fairly quickly and highlight the most important points on each slide. But yeah, just to bear with us for this next session, but I think it's important that we dive deeper into the recommendations of TCFD. So we'll discuss the 4 pillars as well as the 11 sub-recommendations under the main pillars of the TCFD. But before we get into that, we just want to get a quick poll running. So we want to get the audience's view or an understanding from the organization of which of the 4 pillars of the TCFD framework are you or your organization least comfortable with. So is it the governance pillar, strategy, risk management, or metrics and targets? So if you could let us know which level or which pillar of the TCFD recommendations are you least comfortable with, that will kind of give us an indication of where we need to focus or spend a bit more time on. Okay, so we've got a couple of responses coming through. So risk management and governance seem to be areas that people are interested in. Okay, so risk management again coming up strong as one of the areas where people might be not as comfortable with. And metrics and targets as well. So it seems the strategy pillar might be the one where people are most comfortable with, and risk management is coming up as one of the pillars that people are least comfortable with. So it's kind of a similar response that we've seen in other webinars. I think in other webinars, metrics and targets came up quite strongly, but the risk management pillar also was one of those that people identified they're not as comfortable with. And we've got one response for governance. So hopefully the next part of today's session will help enlighten you all a bit more about each of the pillars and specifically the ones that you're interested in. So thanks for everyone who's participated, and it's good to know that we will be going into a bit more on depth on metrics and target a bit later, and we'll be chatting through the risk management pillar in a bit more detail coming up, but thanks to those who've participated. All right. I'm not sure if there's any questions or did someone unmute, but I'm going to go into the next part of session. So this slide is showing the recommendations from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So as mentioned on the previous slide, there are 4 pillars, and the 4 pillars are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. A bit of background on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The Global Financial Stability Board, they established a task force to develop recommendations for more effective climate-related disclosures that can support financial services companies, those who provide investment services, credit, and underwriting to ensure better alignment and to ensure better climate risk management, and that to ensure that climate risk is being considered and integrated within operations. The Financial Stability Board and therefore the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, is committed to market transparency as it makes markets more efficient and stable. But, and this is important to stress, although these recommendations are meant to help with disclosures and market transparency, it's also meant to help companies, investors, and others in their understanding of climate-related risks and provide guidance on how to manage those risks. So while this might present itself as a framework for disclosure, it's also a tool for each individual organization to be able to better integrate climate risks within their organization. And also, while it might seem that this is very much a framework that is aligned to the financial services sector, it's also important to recognize that the TCFD have provided recommendation for all sectors and supplemental guidance for certain specific sectors. And with that being said, let's jump straight into it. So this slide shows again the 4 pillars of the TCFD recommendation, which is governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and target. And it shows the 11 sub-recommendations underneath that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide specifically because we're going to go into each of these pillars and each of these recommendations in the next part of my session. So starting off firstly with governance. This is the first pillar of the TCFD recommendation, and under the governance pillar, the recommendation is for companies to disclose their governance around climate-related risks and opportunities. So the first part, so part A of the governance pillar, is asking organizations to describe their board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. So this is focusing on how the board looks at climate change and how the board manages climate risk. So what committees are there that support the board? What are the processes? How does it work when they're reviewing and guiding strategies, plans of actions? And how does the board monitor and oversee the progress against certain goals and targets for addressing climate-related risks and issues? The second part of the governance pillar is focusing on management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunities. So here, the recommendations are asking people to look at the levels of committees within the organizations, the level of management oversight, whether it's executive management, CEO, executive management or senior management, what level of management is working on managing this or has authority to manage this? What are the processes that support these managers? And what kind of structures does the organization have to help govern the management and processes of managing climate-related risks within the organization? So that's the governance pillar, one part on the board, and part A is focusing on the board and part B is focusing on management's role. There isn't any supplemental guidance specifically for asset managers, but it's good to note that asset managers, or the TCFD notes that asset managers act as fiduciaries, which I'm sure many of you will be well aware of. And as such, asset managers and clients, they rely on reporting from asset managers to help understand how climate-related risks and opportunities are managed within their portfolios. So this framework, TCFD framework, is definitely a helpful tool to help asset managers in providing the right kind of information to their clients. On to the next part of the recommendations, which is the second pillar on strategy. Here, the recommendations are asking organizations to disclose the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business, strategy, and financial planning. So the first part, part A of the second pillar, is asking organizations to describe the climate-related risks and opportunities the organization has identified over the short term, medium term, and long term. So here, organizations should think about what they consider to be the relevant short, medium, and long-term horizons. Here, they should have a description of the risk and opportunities over each of those horizons and any material financial impact on the organizations. And they should also look at providing a description by sector and geography where appropriate in terms of climate risks and opportunities and the organization's strategies. The second part of the strategy pillar is for organizations to describe the impact of climate-related risk on the organization's business strategy and financial planning. So here, while similar to the first part, this one is asking organizations to really talk about how climate risk and opportunity affects the products and services, supply chain, adaptation and mitigation activities, as well as operations, and also looking at how this affects operating costs and revenues, capital expenditures, and I think what would be interesting for organizations in this audience group is whether access to capital would be constrained under certain scenarios. And we're going to talk a bit more about the scenarios later, but it's important to highlight this at this stage. Here they provide a supplemental guidance for asset managers as well. Asset managers to describe how climate-related risks are factored into their different investments or product strategies. So whether you have how you have integrated climate-related risks into your specific retirement fund. Do you use it in valuation? Do you use it on a quantitative way? Do you use it in a qualitative way? And asset managers should describe how each product or investment strategy might be affected by the transition to a low carbon economy. So do you have maybe a resources fund? Do you allocate maybe a lot of capital to certain geographies that are exposed to more transition risks or maybe even physical risks? But these are important questions for asset managers to ask themselves in managing climate change. The last part of the strategy pillar is for organizations to describe the resilience of their strategy into taking consideration the different climate-related scenarios, especially looking at a 2-degree or lower scenario. So we mentioned scenarios a few times today, and we're going to be talking about it a bit more later in more depth. But organizations should describe this recommendation from TCFD is asking people to describe how their strategy is resilient under different kinds of climate change scenarios. So where they believe the strategies will be affected by different risks and opportunities, how they might change the strategies to affect such potential risks and opportunities, and the different time horizons related to those strategies. On to the third pillar, which is about focusing on risk management. So here the organization to disclose how they assess and identify and manage climate-related risk. So the first part about the pillar is talking about the process for identifying climate-related risk and opportunity. Here, the recommendations are asking organizations to describe what they determine to be relevant and significant climate-related risk and how they determine that those are the relevant ones in relation to other risks. And organizations should also consider disclosing or thinking about and asking themselves about the process for assessing the potential size and scope of identified climate-related risks. And importantly here, for users of financial information or for disclosing to clients, it's important to openly publicize or really disclose the types of definitions you use or terminology you use, because these can be slightly nuanced depending on your view on certain risks, opportunities, or definitions or standards or frameworks that you use. There's supplemental guidance provided here for asset managers, and here it's an engagement recommendation. So asset managers should describe how they engage where appropriate with investee companies, about how they encourage their investee companies to improve their performances and practices and integration of climate-related risks, as well as to improve the data availability coming from investee companies, as well as the asset managers themselves. So here under the risk management, the supplemental guidance for asset managers is really talking about engagement or active ownership, if you will. The next pillar of the risk management is asking for or is recommending for organizations to describe the process for managing climate-related risk. Specifically under this pillar, organizations should be talking about how they mitigate, transfer, accept, or control climate-related risks, and also describe the process for how they prioritize the relevant climate-related risks that they've identified, including how the material determinations are made. And supplemental guidance for asset managers from the TCFD here is asking asset managers to describe how they manage climate-related risk for each product or investment strategy they have. So all these pillars are, as you can see, there's a common theme related, or there's quite strong links related between the pillars and between the sub-recommendations. But on this pillar, the focus is, of course, risk management. The last part of the risk management pillar, part C, is asking organizations to describe how they process for identifying, assessing, and managing climate-related risks is integrated into their overall risk management process. So while you might have a standalone process, how is that process then related into the overall risk management process of an organization? And for financial services company, there's plenty of risk management and financial risk management that happens internally within the organization, from solvency and capital adequacy to stress testing and all those kinds of things. And how is climate change, the climate risk management process, integrated into the overall organization risk management process? So that's the risk management pillar of the TCFD recommendations. On to the last pillar now, which is under metrics and targets. So here, this pillar and the recommendation is asking for organizations to disclose the metrics and targets used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. So the first part of this pillar is asking for organizations to disclose the metrics used. Here, organizations should provide the key metrics used to measure climate-related risk and opportunities, and to describe how they consider the use of these metrics associated with, organizations should include metrics on climate-related risks associated with water, energy, land use, and waste management where relevant and applicable. So climate is one kind of metric, but it's broader than that in the sense that it impacts on water, energy, land use, waste management. So there's other metrics and targets, or in this particular part of the recommendations, it's focusing on metrics. And it's not just climate metrics, but also other metrics that are associated with it, such as those around water, energy, land use, and waste management. Metrics should also allow for historical periods to allow for trend analysis. And where not apparent, organizations should provide a description of the methodologies used to calculate or estimate the metrics that they've chosen. For supplemental guidance for asset managers, so here again, asset managers should describe the metrics that they've used for each of their different investment products or strategies, and the organizations, if appropriate, should describe if there's any changes over time, and should also provide any metrics considered in the investment decisions and monitoring process. So some supplemental guidance provided by the TCFD here for the metrics pillar. And the next part of the metrics pillar is about disclosing scope 1, scope 2, and if appropriate, scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And I mentioned this upfront earlier on in the conversation today in our workshop about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions and why that's kind of important. And here we see it's a key part of the recommendations from the TCFD that organizations should provide their scope 1 and scope 2. And here for financial institutions, it's scope 3 GHG emissions that are very relevant, because for scope 1 and scope 2, there's not a lot of burning of fossil fuels for financial institutions on their operational sites at their head offices. While there is business travel and electricity that's used in relation to other sectors, this is quite small, especially if you look at intensity-based measures. So relative to the revenue a financial institution earns, the electricity consumed and fossil fuels burnt on site is quite small, whereas scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions, the indirect emissions that come as a result of lending money or investing in certain companies, these are probably the more important ones for financial institutions. And these greenhouse gas emissions, the way in which one can calculate them should be in line with international best practice, particularly around the GHG protocol methodology, which is widely used and widely accepted. Again, here they recommend that emissions and associated metrics should also be provided for historical periods to allow for trend analysis. And again, if one should disclose and talk about and think about the methodologies used to calculate and estimate these metrics. This next slide is important, I think, for asset managers, as it provides some supplemental guidance provided by the TCFD. Here, asset managers should provide the weighted average carbon intensity where data is available and can be reasonably estimated for each product or investment strategy. In addition, asset managers should provide other metrics they believe are useful for decision-making, again, along with the description of the methodology. And TCFD have provided some common carbon footprinting and exposure metrics that financial institutions can look at. These are weighted average carbon intensity, which I think we'll talk about a bit more, is talking about looking at your portfolio, how much of each of those companies or assets that you've lent or invested in, what is their carbon emissions, and then looking at your ownership in them. So if you have a 50% ownership stake in a company, then 50% of that carbon emissions kind of belongs to that particular financial institution that provided that finance. And if you have a whole portfolio of companies, then you take your ownership level of each of those companies, multiply it by their carbon emissions, and you sum that up and you can get a weighted average carbon intensity for your portfolio. And then, look at total carbon emissions, which we talked about of scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. You add those up. But as mentioned, the scope 3 emissions are probably most important. Carbon footprint and carbon intensity. Your carbon intensity is looking at scaling your carbon emissions for your revenue. So how many tons of carbon do you emit per 1 million rand in revenue? That's your intensity. So it's looking at your absolute divided by your revenue. So you take your carbon footprint or your total carbon emissions, and you divide that by your carbon intensity and your exposure to carbon-related assets. So how much of financing have you allocated to coal? How much of your portfolio have you allocated to natural gas or oil? So these are some of the metrics that are recommended by the TCFD. On to the last part of the metrics and targets pillar, which is talking about the targets that are used by the organization. So here, organizations should describe their climate-related targets, such as those related to greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, energy usage, and those that are in line with anticipated regulatory requirements or market constraints and other goals. Other goals may include efficiency or financial goals, financial loss tolerances, avoided greenhouse gas emissions, or net revenue goals for products and services. In talking about targets, organizations should include the following: whether the target is absolute, so this is your tons of greenhouse gas emissions, that's total in absolute, or intensity based, where you are scaling for revenue, so tons of CO2 equivalent per million rand in revenue, as an example. The time frames, as well as the base year that you're using for those time frames, and then key performance indicators used to assess the progress against those targets. So that is the fourth pillar of the TCFD recommendations. So we spoke about metrics, then we spoke about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And then the last part C, is talking about the targets. So how do you set the targets and how do you measure and monitor progress for that? And TCFD provided some supplemental guidance for asset owners here and asset managers, where they recommended some certain key metrics or common metrics that are used and used globally as kind of best practice, or used commonly by financial institutions and investors to look at carbon related risks and metrics and performance.